Wisdom, it's a fuzzy concept. We know it when we see it. We're all familiar with the concept of wisdom, but we can't always put it into words. We know that being wise is associated with experience and with age. But on the other hand, we recognize that people have experience or have age without being wise. Can wisdom be learned? Can it be developed? Can it be improved? Is it something that can be measured? And what does wisdom mean when it's talked about in terms of the workplace? My name is Chris Anstead. I work with organizations and individuals to help them develop their competencies in areas such as strategic thinking, critical thinking, and wisdom. I have a channel here called Wisdom in the Workplace, and today I want to talk specifically about wisdom. Now, wisdom can be described. Okay, I mentioned earlier, it's something we all know. If you're human, you understand the concept of wisdom. That's true across all cultures, all human cultures, and it's true across all recorded human history and probably in prehistory too. We've all heard stories of the wise man or wise woman that might be centuries old. And the fact that this understanding exists across such a wide range points to the fact that wisdom is somehow inscribed in our brains. It's part of our neurobiological evolution. We have over time developed competencies, strengths, patterns of thinking that are hardwired in our brain that relate to wisdom. So we know wisdom can be described. If it can be described, it can be defined. And that's something I'm going to turn to in a minute when I talk through some definitions of wisdom. But clearly, if you can see something, you can start to define it. And if you can define it, you can deconstruct it. In other words, we know that wisdom is a collection of competencies, of strengths, of behaviors, of practices. And if we know it's a collection of such things, such complex things, then we also know that we can start to pull it apart and we can start to say, well, what are the key strengths? What are the key competencies or behaviors that really go to making up wisdom? So it can be deconstructed. And if it can be deconstructed, then it can be developed in the sense that each of those things, each of those different competencies, strengths, behaviors, experiences are things that we can work on. We can improve our own abilities in specific competencies through practice, through study, through gathering experience, and through training. So wisdom can be developed. If it can be developed, it can be deployed. So that's the final part of this little chain here, is to say that wisdom is something that can be useful in a variety of settings. It can be useful in social settings, it can be useful in family settings, legal settings, but it can be deployed in the workplace and it can be useful in corporate settings and small business settings. So I mentioned earlier that I would talk a bit about the definition of wisdom, and I want to start by referencing this article. It's an article in the Harvard Review of Psychiatry. It came out in 2019 by Ellen Lee and Dilip Jest. And as you can see, it's called The Emerging Empirical Science of Wisdom. What these authors did was they went to the literature on wisdom, and this is literature in psychology, in neurobiology, I believe maybe in literature, but certainly in anthropology. And they took a look at how wisdom was found, defined, measured, the kind of data that was used in all these studies. And they looked for commonalities. Again, they looked at a wide range of research from a number of different nations, different settings, done in different languages, done in different disciplines. And they looked for those few areas or those specific areas where all those studies agreed on the components of wisdom. And they found six components that showed up every time when wisdom was being discussed. And here they are. So the first of these was a general knowledge of life and social decision making. In other words, to be wise, you need to have a certain experience with life. You need to understand how decisions are made from a social context, which can include from a political context. So how people make decisions, how decisions are ignored or carried forward, what the outcome of different decision-making processes might be, and then just generally this general knowledge of life. We'll talk about some more examples of these things later. Emotional regulation was also found to be a marker of wisdom. What this means is that people who were seen as wise were people who had their emotions under control or who did not give in to emotional extremities when presented with problems and issues and crises. So emotional regulation was important to the observed definition of wisdom. The next element are these pro-social behaviors, compassion and empathy. So if you're wise, when you're making decisions, when you're making judgments, when you're making recommendations, you're not just considering very simple measures of functionality and efficiency. You're also thinking through the emotional piece, the good and bad side of what you're doing. You're having compassion for the people who are being impacted or affected by your decisions, and you're putting yourself in their place and in the place of other people that are involved, other stakeholders. Wisdom includes number 4, insight and self-reflection. Individuals who are seen as wise had self-awareness. They knew what their own strengths and weaknesses were. They brought that insight to bear when making their own decisions. Acceptance of different value systems. So individuals who are wise, and again, it's tied to their experience, their wide experience of life, they recognize that not everybody shares the same value systems. Those value systems might be different from culture to culture, nation to nation, different business organizations, even different people in different settings in a very local situation might have different value systems. And the wise person recognizes that and also is willing to accept that some of those value systems are just as appropriate or well-founded as their own. And finally, decisiveness. Wise individuals didn't simply analyze and dither and think about things. They made decisions, and they made decisions at an appropriate speed. So those are the 6 elements that these authors found in all the literature of wisdom. There were 3 other elements here listed 7, 8, and 9, which showed up in many of the studies, but not every single one of those studies. And the 3 elements are spirituality, or having a belief in something bigger than the individual, openness to new experiences. Now we're going to talk about wide perspective and how important that is to wisdom in a minute, but the openness to new experiences is something that supports that wider perspective. And finally, a sense of humor. Now, not every person who's wise is also funny, but having a sense of humor can be very helpful and often is seen as the mark of someone, or at least an important part of being a wise person. Now, what I want to talk about really is what I'm calling the wisdom equation. And the wisdom equation is simply an operational definition of wisdom. So to be effective, wisdom needs to be deployed. In other words, you need to be able to um, not just think, but to do. So the operational definition of wisdom involves employing thoughtful judgment based on a broad perspective to influence or make good decisions. And I would argue that it's made up of 3 groups of competencies. The first group of competencies and strengths and behaviors are those related to perspective. And you can see the 6 that I've listed here. Perspective, a broad perspective, is really important to bringing wisdom to the workplace. So a broad perspective in this sense might include just experience in the subject that you're talking about, that you're deciding about, that you're having meetings on. So having that experience, if you're in a retail setting and you've got 10 years frontline retail experience, then you bring a certain wisdom to the table that somebody without that would not be able to do. Social knowledge, though, is also an important part of perspective. And social knowledge, we mentioned in the literature study, has to do with understanding how decisions are made, how people align along different values and different requirements, how people accept the outcomes of decisions, how people feel included or not included in decision making. It's all that social knowledge around how to get things done. And in a leader, that can be very political, but for the person who's wise without necessarily being a leader, it's really around this social element of decision making and action. Ethics is the next piece of perspective. So having a broad perspective includes having an ethical perspective. Again, that relates to knowing how to choose between good and bad, knowing that there are, in fact, things that are for the good, the greater good, whether it's the good of society, the good of the planet, the good of specific individuals or groups. Just having that ethical perspective is really important to bringing your wisdom into play. Relativism is another piece of perspective or another aspect of perspective that is very critical to wise thinking. You have to be sure or understand that not everything is as you've experienced it. So you've grown up in one place, you've gone through one career, you've been trained in certain things, you've lived a certain family life. Other people have had other experiences. They've been brought up in other ways. They've been brought up with other values and other experiences. They've had different lived experiences. The wise person understands this and recognizes and values the different experiences, the different values, the different sets of perspective that other individuals bring to the table. Humility. Humility is an important part of wisdom, and really the most important type of humility is intellectual humility or humility about knowledge. The wise individual recognizes that whatever the topic is that's being discussed, whatever the action is that's being considered, there's a lot of additional information and knowledge out there that they don't command. That they have a piece of the pie, but the pie is big. And so that humility around what you know and therefore willingness to learn more or to learn from others is really important to wisdom in the workplace. Finally, we've got self-awareness. I mentioned this again earlier in the section on the literature review. The wise individual is trying always to be cognizant of their own bias in thinking. They're aware of their own strengths and their own weaknesses. They're aware of their tendencies. They're aware of their own history. And they're conscious of what they're doing as they go through a process of making a judgment, making a decision, making a recommendation, trying to influence others. They're self-aware. So that's the perspective piece. But perspective without doing anything, it's not wisdom. So the next piece has to do with action, and that's judgment. So the action associated with wisdom is making decisions or bringing human judgment to bear. And here are some strengths and competencies in this package, in the judgment package, that are important to the wise individual. The first is risk assessment. So a wise individual recognizes that risk exists. They recognize that if they're recommending doing something that was done before successfully, it doesn't mean it's going to be successful this time. There's a risk. The unknown is out there, whether it's a black swan event or simply a competitor in the marketplace who reacts in a different way than you expect, or some financial crisis. They understand that risk exists, and they have ways to measure it, to measure the chance that a risk might take place or the impact that the risk might have. They also know how to evaluate choices, the second point here. So when they're making a decision or coming up with a recommendation, they know that choices need to be evaluated in a somewhat structured way or formal way, again, depending on the situation, but even in a very quick decision, they think through the choices. They don't just jump on the first solution that they hear about. They look at criteria for measuring choices. They weigh those criteria, and then they make their recommendation or their decision. This ties to the third criteria or the third competency, which is really around experience again. So again, this is one of those places where wisdom really does correlate with age and experience. If you've made a lot of decisions, if you've been involved in decision making a lot, then you're going to have this experience, which you can bring to bear in making a decision or employing judgment. The fourth piece is the moral standard. Now, I've mentioned ethics earlier. The moral standard really is around applying your views of good and bad, applying your value system, your ethics, and doing more than just knowing about them, but actually putting them into play. The next two competencies here are around different kinds of thinking. The first one is systems thinking or holistic thinking. Wise individuals understand that the decisions they're making, the things they're thinking about are complex. They are able to anticipate the impact of decisions across a large range of different parts of an organization, of different groups in a society, of different individuals on a team. And they see how different types of decision components or pieces of the puzzle all fit together and impact one another. They are also good at critical thinking. Critical thinking really relates to understanding cognitive biases, your own, but also those of the people you're working with. You can understand why somebody might say something, what the hidden meaning is of what somebody's saying or doing. You might be better at understanding the language choices they're making, and you challenge assumptions. So critical thinking and systems thinking sets you up to deploy your wisdom in a thoughtful way, but they also are ways in which humans are much better than AI these days. So AI as it exists today is really about compressing the amount of time and the scope of data analysis, review, and decision making. AI is great at making decisions on data. It's not great at making holistic decisions, considering value and complexity and impact across large, chaotic organizations. Humans are great at that, and that's where wisdom in the workplace is really, I think, one of the key abilities or characteristics that people should have in the workplace of the future. Finally, compassion. Now, compassion is different from moral standard, and it's different from the the question of ethics that I raised earlier. Compassion has to do with making a decision that might not be the best decision from an efficiency point of view or from a profit point of view, but that takes other things into account, such as the impact on individuals, the impact on society, the impact on vulnerable populations, the impact on animals or the earth. Compassion has to do with injecting, again, some moral standards, some ethics into a decision in a way that allows you to make a decision that, again, might not be the optimal decision for your bank account, but should be the best decision for your society or culture. Now, the third bundle of competencies that I want to talk about in the wisdom equation have to do with communication. And the reason that I've put that into this whole equation is that wisdom requires perspective. The action associated with wisdom is judgment. But unless you can communicate your judgment, your recommendation, your decision based on your perspective, then it's all for nothing. And that's really why it's an operational definition. So in the workplace, having communication skills are just as important as having the ability to judge and to bring a broad perspective. Now, there's a lot of communication skills that I could have mentioned here, but the ones that I have here, I think, are the ones that really show the difference between somebody communicating their wisdom from someone just generally communicating um, good stuff in a general way. So first of all, empathy. I've mentioned empathy here. I've mentioned it in some of the other talk that I've mentioned. But empathy here has to do with understanding where the listener is coming from. So if you're communicating a recommendation to an individual or a group or your boss or what have you, you need to understand where they're coming from. How are they going to hear what you say? What are they going to think about it? Does it align with their values? Does it make sense from their background, from their perspective? Or perhaps it doesn't. So how are you going to convince them? How are you going to put yourself in their shoes and say, this is a good way forward and here's the reasons why. So empathy is an important communication element in wisdom. Listening here, really I'm talking about the act of listening. Uh, the fact that you need to not just communicate out what you're recommending or deciding, but you need to hear what how your team reacts to that communication, or your colleagues or your family, or however you're using this. You need to listen to their objections. You need to listen to their suggestions, their comments. Maybe they're adding value, and you need to be able to absorb that added value, whether it's positive or negative, and reflect it back in your conversation around your recommendation and judgment. Finally, figurative language. Wise people, again, and this is kind of the historical description of wisdom, wise people use figurative language to make their points. They use allegories, they use analogies, they tell stories, they use narrative forms. So figurative language, the use of figurative language is really important to communicating your wisdom. When you're out there trying to get a point across based on your broad experience, your ethics, your understanding of relativism, you need to be able to make the case using analogies, stories, not simply technical language or rational language, but a more colorful, inclusive way of speaking. So that's really the end of what I'm calling the wisdom equation. I hope you found this helpful. I hope you accept the argument that wisdom is, in fact, something that can be defined. And because it can be defined, described, deconstructed, it can be developed. In some of my other videos, I will look at some of the ways in which we can develop specific aspects of wisdom, some of those specific competencies in there. I will also take a look at the correlation with leadership, and how do wise leaders act, and is it different from how wise individuals act? One of the other things I want to come back to is this correlation with age. It is a strong correlation, but it's not a linear correlation. You can be wise with a certain amount of experience. You don't necessarily get wiser the more experience you have. There's also another interesting correlation that I want to mention, and that's happiness. When you go into the literature and you look at the studies that ask people to self-rate themselves on certain wisdom attributes and behaviors, you also find that the people that feel that they're wise are the people that also are happy and have good mental health. So it's not an absolute correlation in the sense that external people aren't measuring wisdom and then applying it, but it's still a really interesting correlation, and hopefully something that will intrigue you further. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Check out my channel for some other videos on these same topics. And if you do like it, please hit the like button or subscribe. Thanks again.